Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Bishop Bryan coming to you live from the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains here on this May 24th, 2016. Today we continue what we started last week, the loaded subject matter of who is Satan. We didn't finish last time, and so now we are going to move further into this most challenging and difficult of subjects as we cross over from the conventional theology and enter into the realm of the esoteric and mystical. And this can be, for most, a disastrous transition. You're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to trust yourself. And you're going to have to be willing to break some paradigms. Otherwise, turn the show off right now, because you're not going to like what we're going to reveal. But it doesn't matter if you like it. It only matters that you understand it. Stay tuned. Well, welcome back, everyone, and I want to thank you all for joining me today for this part two on this very, like I said, complicated and loaded subject matter. There's a lot of opinions about the nature of Satan, and most people, when they, if they have an interest in this subject, they're coming to it from a very conventional theological understanding, and not necessarily from a proper mystical esoteric. And remember, the more mystical and esoteric the conceptualization is, the closer it is to the actual condition, and further away it is from the literalism of simile and metaphor that's found all throughout the theological tradition of all religions. And that's where a lot of these confusions come from. It's where a lot of these, paradigms are built from. And the paradigms are what are dangerous. The paradigms are what adversely affect us. And so we have to be extremely careful as we move further into this subject. I don't want there to be any confusion. I don't want this to be a stumbling block for any of you and your spiritual lives. But the Holy Nicolean Catholic Church has never been about taking the easy route. This is about understanding. It's about integration. That's a key word for today. We will revisit it several times, I promise you. Well, last time we talked about some complicated theological references where we see that Jesus and Satan, or I should say, let's put it this way, Jesus and the devil are using similar terminology to refer to themselves. And the conventional explanation for this that the church has provided over the years is that this is because the devil wants to be God. The devil wants you to worship him like you worship God. And so therefore he assumes these titles for himself, like Lucifer, the light bearer. It's been so integrated into the archetype of the devil that now Lucifer has become a proper noun or proper, an actual name for the devil. And it, even though in the Latin this reference to the light bearer refers to Jesus also. And we also saw in the Orthodox theology last time with the story of Baal that the angel of God being represented as a precursor to the revelation of Jesus, also refers to himself as a Satan, which is an adversary, because he is taking on the role or an adversarial role within that particular theological story. So where does this leave us? Last time we didn't have time to really go into any of it. We had to cut off at a very critical point in the discussion. So now we're going to go further into the realm of the mystical and esoteric to try to discuss some of the theological implications of this. I assure you, it is no accident. There are no accidents in the realm of the archetypal. Even things that happen, like interpretation errors or issues of semantics that can confuse and corrupt over time, these are not accidents. They have archetypal functions. It almost serves like a purpose, but not really. The purpose is perhaps the human brain reading into it a little bit too closely, when all that's necessary is just to accept the functionality without ascribing a purpose to it. You'll find that in the cosmos, God doesn't need a purpose to do anything. God simply just does. He wills it into being. And that's the only purpose that there needs to be, because he wants it to be so. We're always looking for the meaning to life. Well, the best way to answer that question, the meaning of life, is function. And that is a good segue for understanding the devil, or Satan, or Lucifer, or however you wish to classify him. Another way of being able to further our understanding here is to maybe get into some of the understandings that are found in Hinduism, because Eastern philosophy tends to give us a little bit of a better picture on how to interpret these difficult things. The Western tradition masks it, and anytime things are hidden, they become objects of fear. And fear is always a doorway into evil. And evil does exist. It's not an illusion. It's just a misunderstood principle. And we're going to hopefully make that more clear here in a moment. So let's get into it. Now, I'm assuming you have listened to part 1. If you didn't, you're going to be a little bit lost, perhaps. I don't know. I'll do my best to try to make it relevant, but you should really go back and listen to part 1 if you didn't. Let's talk about creation. Because in the esoteric tradition, which transcends the limitations of theology, the devil is understood, or what we call, what we would understand to be the devil, as a personified fallen angel, an adversary of God, the very word Satan meaning adversary, okay? We could say that he is the creative energy at its most material point, at its most dense point. We shouldn't look at creation as simply the physical world. We should look at the sum of the cosmos as creation, which contains a lot of things that we do not understand. The subatomic, for you scientifically oriented out there, the subatomic is a perfect example here of something that we don't totally understand. Not to get into it too far, but to give you an example, the nature of electrons. Electrons are very difficult to observe because what we have been able to determine in the different experiments that theoretical physicists do, that electrons are essentially in several places at once. And only when we look at them, when we look at an object, of course we can't really see the electrons, they're too small, of course, but we can see the manifestation of what they help to create, which is the matter that we do understand, that we do see. And when we look at it, then they get fused into one spot. As soon as we look away, they go back to existing in several places at once, which doesn't make any sense as far as our understanding of the laws of physics. And I would need to be a lot more advanced in my own personal understanding of physics to really give you a better explanation than that. But what it does show is that our awareness, which is largely, entirely non-corporeal, is somehow directing the corporeal. If electrons help to make up the corporeal physical world in the form of matter, then the very fact that matter becomes fixed when we look at it, when we direct our attention to it, which is the direction of our awareness, we are then able to see the cohesive reality that we call the real world, but only when we fix our attention on it. Which begs the question, the age-old adage, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, in this understanding, the answer to that is no, it does not. Because it doesn't even fall, because it's not even there. It's only there when someone is there to observe it. So observation becomes everything. And this is why in the mystical esoteric tradition, the emphasis is on objective observation. Because it is only through objective observation that we are able to make the types of assessments we need to be able to fully realize the sum of our cosmic condition. That is broken down into two principles. What we call in mysticism the creative principle and the reabsorption principle. In other words, things come into being and then things move back out of being. We experience this as birth and death. We experience this as entropy, the unidirectional movement from order to disorder. But in reality, things come into being for a time. They are created. They are manifest. They hold function. And then over time, through entropy, that energy disperses. It breaks down. And eventually, it gets reabsorbed. We know from the laws of thermodynamics that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. So therefore, creation in this sense is the organization of energy, and reabsorption is the dismantling of energy so that it can be recycled and reutilized in future successive creations. Now that's a dramatic exchange. And it's kind of dry when you remove and divorce it from the theology of the book of Genesis, where God says, "Let there be light." You know, a story about the ineffable principles of creation. But as we see, creation can only come about through fragmentation. In other words, there must be contrast. So, you cannot have, like a photograph, for those of you who are photographers, you understand this very well. If you apply too much contrast, the picture will go dark. If you don't apply enough contrast, the picture will go white. It will wash itself out. It is only through the proper balance of contrast do we get to see the picture in its sharpest form. It is a constant interplay between light and dark. But think about it this way, and this is where, for you very orthodox, conventional Christian thinkers, you're going to like this a little bit more, because it's going to help to put some context to what you already believe in. The nature of light is the genuine expression of reality. Darkness is merely the absence of that reality. So the philosophers of the church have always taught that evil is not really an existent thing. It is merely the absence of the good. It is a vacuum. It is an abyss. It is a void. But is not an existing quality of its own. It does not exist on its own merit. Unlike the creative and reabsorption faculties of the cosmos, reabsorption is not the absence of creation. It is what makes creation possible. So, in order to understand the devil, and in order to understand the theological references that I shared with you last time, that sort of puts Jesus and the devil in the same category, using the same semantics, the same terminology, we need to understand that our notions of the devil are bastardizations of these truths. We're not really understanding them correctly because we're dualistic, and that's an accident of creation. So just like when you're doing photography and you're developing a picture, you don't say that the light aspects are good and the dark aspects are evil. You wouldn't make that distinction. You would just simply say that in order for photography to work, there has to be a polarity that exists between a perfect balance of light and dark, lightness and darkness, so that we can make out things. If everything was pure light, we wouldn't be able to see anything. It would be all washed out in the light. Likewise, if there was no light, if everything was dark, we still would be as blinded as we would if we were drowned in light. It is only the balance of the two that makes vision as we understand it as human beings possible. But what happens when we take that experience and corrupt it through ignorance and misunderstanding? Well, polarity then goes to duality. Duality is when we start to place value judgments where being in the light is better than being in the dark. Why? Because we like it more. It's safer to be in light, right? We can see predators. We can see dangers before they happen. You walk around in the dark, well, chances are you're going to fall and hurt yourself eventually. No one wants to be blind, right? We see that as a disability for a reason. So duality is when we start to classify our perceptions of the polarity of existence and place a value judgment in saying the things that we like we call good, the things that we don't like we call evil. This is where the devil comes from. Now, in Hinduism, we've talked about their trinity, which is Brahma, the created God, the creation God, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. All three combine to make up Brahman, which is the highest absolute principle of God, and that is reflected in us as the Atman, which is our highest awareness, because the Brahman is largely ineffable, but we can experience it through Atman. But each of those gods has a consort, which is sort of almost an extreme emanation of the original. So for Shiva, which is the destroying principle, which would be in the mystical terms equivalent to a personification of the reabsorption principle of the universe. Shiva doesn't destroy to harm you. Shiva destroys because that is a necessary component to the process of creation. Without Shiva, Brahma cannot do his work because he would have nothing to work with. Remember? Energy cannot be created. You may say, well, God transcends these laws. Well, not so fast. God is these laws. So now, Shiva has a consort that the Hindus call Kali or Kali Ma. And she is a radicalized expression of the destructive principle, almost out of control. Only Shiva can keep her in check. In fact, there's a Hindu legend where she got out of control. She was going to destroy the whole universe, but Shiva stood in her way and was able to calm her back down. Kali is not evil. In fact, she is invoked in Hinduism to destroy demons, because she has such raw destructive force that she even has the power to destroy the evil bastardizations. And so you might argue that what evil is, or what Satan is for the Christian, is essentially the bastardized version of the reabsorption principle of the cosmos. This is why in the Old Testament we don't see references to the devil as this all-pervading power of source of evil that stands against God. We don't see that in the Old Testament. And that's the reason. Because there was no reason to invent it yet. It was only when we started to quantify and place value judgments upon the process of creation that the devil was then born. And get ready for this. This is going to be difficult for a lot of you. We create the devil. We hold in our hands as reflections of God, as being made in God's image. We hold also the powers of creation. And on a more limited basis, of course. We don't create entire universes in the way that he can. But we can do a similar thing through the powers of our imagination in the form of writing stories, producing art. Look at Star Wars. That's a whole universe that does not exist anywhere outside of the framework of the story. And yet, at the archetypal level, all of it is completely, absolutely true. We've talked about what truth is in relation to actual conditions. There's conventional truth, there's absolute truth, and sometimes the only way to understand these realities of God is to reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable paradoxes through understanding that conventional truth and absolute truth don't always and often don't agree, and yet both are true, despite the fact that they stand often in opposition to each other. That is the complexity of God. That is the complexity of the creation through which he has left us as stewards of that creation. And in order to reach salvation, we must be prepared to completely master it. Creation is destructive. It has to be. For the energy of creation is built on the ashes of whatever came before it. That is the true meaning of the archetype of the phoenix, of which Jesus Christ is the Christian representative. He is the phoenix that rises from his own ashes. He conquers death by dying, which is completely paradoxical. I, as you know, am an exorcist. That's the primary outreach of the Holy Nicolaitan Catholic Church. And so demonology and understanding the nature of Satan is an important part of my job. I would not be an effective exorcist if I did not at least make some attempt at understanding the demonic realm and understanding the satanic. But as also a mystic, which is, if exorcism is the outreach of this church, mysticism is its inner life. We are not just the church that you can come to resolve spiritual problems through exorcism or through healing, but we are also a place to come to cultivate an understanding of the divine, to awaken our spiritualities towards maturity. And so that is a very distressing work. In fact, it leaves me often drained, exhausted, sometimes ill. Because that process of maturity means I have to crack off parts of my corrupted nature, which leaves me exposed and vulnerable to spiritual infection. And yet there is no other way to get healthy. Just as Jesus had to die in order to live. There was no other way to do it. Creation could not be restored any other way. It is reconciled through paradox, which means that the devil is an essential player in the story of redemption. Remember we talked about, oh happy fault, the sin of Adam and Eve, which brought about so great a Redeemer? Remember we talked about that? Well, this is part of what it means. In the New Testament, Judas betrays our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And if he hadn't, Jesus would have never been led to the crucifixion that redeemed us. And we are even told by the New Testament that Judas was possessed at that point. The devil's an essential player that comes about through extreme conditions, which is why walking the middle path of moderation is the only way. You cannot be a reactionary. You will be annihilated if you choose the path of reactionaryism. You will be annihilated if you choose the path of extremism. This cosmos is built upon perfect balance, which is only achieved through moderation. Now, it's difficult for us to see it with all of our biases that we cultivate in religion, when we should be cultivating a much higher realization than that. Theology was not created to be a paradigm. Theology was created to be a model through which we could cultivate our understanding, but it's not used that way. That misuse is Satan. That's how he is born. Out of the shadows of creation. He is the dark principle of creation. And of course, because Jesus had to be an extreme example for the fallen cosmos could be redeemed and restored no other way, his actions, by virtue of their extreme, had to create a counterbalance. Not a dualism, a polarization of which the devil is born. We play out that process in our lives constantly. What makes me an effective exorcist is that I understand this all too well. And I'm not afraid to say so. In fact, not to pat myself on the back, but I think I understand it almost better than anyone I've ever met, which is a sad fact. It is erroneous to see exorcism as spiritual warfare. It is not a war. It is integration. How do we heal a possessed person? What is a possessed person? Well, a possessed person is somebody who has fragmented into the extremes. Perhaps they have cultivated such a scrupulous pursuit towards Jesus Christ that every aspect of themselves that is in the realm of the shadow, that is the contrast to their nature, which is part of how they can continue to exist, gets fragmented off and quickly demonizes itself in the form of what we call demonic possession. It is only through the work of the exorcist, by carefully executing an integration of that fragmentation back into the psyche of the victim, does healing start to come about. That's a true exorcism. So you might say, well, what's with these elaborate rituals? And it sounds a lot like spiritual warfare to me. Well, that's because we're dealing with archetypal patterns. And archetypal patterns exist as individual beings, as entities. Far more real than you or I could ever hope to be, actually. That's, again, part of the humorous paradoxes that we find over and over again overlapping themselves within the process of creation, within the cosmos. But it cannot be disregarded any other way. These are real entities now. They are thought forms, projections of the human psyche that manifest in every way as the real things that they are archetypally, which transcends human psyche. In fact, human psyche is merely made up of these patterns of archetypal forms. That is what the human psyche is. And so therefore they must be dealt with at an archetypal level, which means we employ the vehicle of the story. So if we're going to process in a real and dynamic way the integration of an individual who is now fragmented to the point that demonic possession has now affected their life, the only way is to heal the fragmentation and bring them back into one solid form again. It's no coincidence. Remember I said there's no accidents? It's no coincidence that the very word schizophrenia, which is, the mental disorder of psychosis that often imitates demonic possession. In fact, you might even say from a psychological point of view, demonic possession is a type of psychosis, just with more of a non-corporeal spiritual root causation. But you might say that the reason the word schizophrenia means split mind. Of course, it's fragmented mind. So we heal it through integration. You can never win your fight against the devil by fearing him, by running from him, by rebuking him, by shunning him, by loathing him. You can only beat him by integrating him. The very nature of fragmentation is the very work of the satanic. That is what it means to be an adversary, to stand in opposition to the free-flowing energy of the cosmos itself. It creates disruptions and ripples and fragments because it's fragile. The cosmos is not as enduring as it looks. It's an extremely fragile reality that only by the grace of God does it continue to exist. Only by the grace of God. No, through no other way. So you might say, well, Bishop, what does this mean? What are the implications for the average Christian? I'm not even really understanding everything you're saying. I have not studied mysticism. I am not an esotericist. I have never dabbled in the occult, so I don't get what you're saying. And my words to you are this. You don't have to understand everything at this level. You don't even have to accept everything that I've shared with you today. Even though everything I have shared with you is closer to the absolute truth than anything you're ever going to get through theology. And that's okay. The theology is not wrong. It's conventionally true, which is just as true as the absolute truths I've just shared with you. Or I should say the more absolute truths, because there's only so far you can go. The absolute is genuinely unknowable. And so we just try to strive to reach it, but our limited faculties of intellection prevent us from ever really getting there. We can just keep striving, which is fine. Keeps things interesting. So, to you all, to those of you in the Christian worldview, I simply say, continue on understanding what the church has taught. All of it is true. All of it is conventionally true. But understand this. The devil is an essential aspect. He cannot be dismissed. He cannot be eradicated through any other way but integration. He only exists because of the fragmentation, which is what original sin is. That's essentially what really happened. That's what knowledge of good and evil really does. It's about duality. Do you understand that the fruit of knowledge of good and evil is the vessel through which things become fragmented into duality? Do you see the metaphor? I hope so. Although I know it's not terribly clear, but it's also necessary for our mastery of creation, which is what we're being prepared for, which was what the kingdom of heaven essentially is. The kingdom of heaven is to become a master of creation, to become not godlike, but co-creators with God. The church teaches that the communion of saints is, the beatific vision is integration into God, wholeness, fullness. The opposite of that, the realm of the satanic, is extremism, reactionaryism, imbalance. The more you run, the more power you give him. You must integrate the darkness that exists within yourself, because you know where hell really is? The realm of the devil? It's right inside you. It exists nowhere else. The cosmos is perfectly content. It exists in the perfection of God. The fallen world is our perception of it. That's the original sin. Our errors of perception that takes the perfection of the cosmos, that utilizes polarity in order to create, which is the fundamental principle of God anyway, and bastardizes it into duality. Us versus them, good versus evil, you and me. Wholeness is the result of integration. You must learn, if you are to become a mature Christian, you must learn to integrate your dark side. There's so much more that we could say here today, but there is just no time. So I'm going to leave you with this and say, this is Bishop Bryan Willett saying thank you, and until next time, God bless.